Before I talk about embedded systems in my next video, I just want you guys to be familiar with certain types of loops. Some of the loops that I'm going to be going over is the if statement, else, while loop, for loop, some conditional statements, and I'm also going to show you guys how to enter input into the serial prompt and use that as part of your code. In order to use an input, you need to use the function read within the serial library, and you have to initialize that as a variable. In this case, I just named it input, and you're able to use input freely wherever you want, wherever you need these values to be. In this case, I'm just printing them out to the screen. The problem with this sketch, though, is if I ran this sketch, it would be trying to print something in the screen constantly, as fast as it possibly can go, even when I didn't give it an input yet. And that can lead to some weird results. So what you need to do is you need to somehow say that you do not want the void loop to start its function until you type something in the command prompt. And once you type something into the command prompt, then you execute what's in the loop. And you do that with an if statement. So all I did here was put in an if statement saying that if you receive any input from the serial prompt, then you execute whatever's in this loop. If you want something to run continuously, even if you don't put in any input in the screen, then you would just put whatever you wanted out of the if statement. So you might think, just by looking at this, this will output whatever you put into the prompt, but that's not particularly true. Let's say if you enter in a 0, you would expect to get a 0 back, right? Well, you get the number 48. You get a 1, you get 49. You can even input letters, and you get other numbers back. That's because it is following a standard protocol called ASCII. ASCII is just a way of representing certain symbols with numbers. And if you want to represent a letter, for example, then you'd have to signify that as a char. It just means a character. And there's a way how to do that in the Arduino code. You notice how I entered 0 and I got 48 back? That's because it was entering it in decimal form. If I wanted to get a 0 back, I would have to indicate the type as a char. So now, instead of having the input be an int, I'm going to name it a char instead. As you can see, when I entered in a 0, I got a 0 back. Same with any other number or even letter. Well, what if you wanted to receive a number with 2 digits? Let's say you wanted to receive a 10. You just can't put 10 in the prompt because it only reads one value at a time. So what you have to do to fix that is, there's a couple of ways to do that. What I usually do is I would put an int at the beginning, and then I would subtract a char 0 from the serial read. The 2 tick marks just means it's represented as a char. This is the exact same thing as saying subtract 48, because 48 is the same thing as 0 in the ASCII sheet. So if I subtract 0, I'll get the same numbers back, but now I can start using letters as numbers. If I want to use input anywhere else in my sketch, I have to initialize this variable outside of the if statement. If I don't do that, it won't recognize when I say int outside of the if statement. Like right here, if I mentioned if input reads as 0 and have it do something, it won't know what I'm talking about. because input is only defined in the if statement. So in order to fix that, I can just call that as input and have input be initialized throughout the whole entire void loop. So what happens if input reads as 0? Well, we can have it do whatever we want. So I thought this would be a good time to go over for loops now. So what's happening here is I have a LED on pin 11, which is a pulse width modulation. Nothing is happening unless I enter something into the serial prompt, because everything that I have is within serial.available if statement. It's going to, when I enter in input, it's going to store it in the variable input, and it's going to print it to the screen. If input reads as 0, it will fade out, and if input reads as 1, it will fade in. The reason why these are fading out and fading in is because if you enter in 1, the integer I, which is a variable that you just make up, is 0. You put a semicolon, and then you initialize when you don't want the statement to be true anymore, and that's when I is less than or equal to 255. The I++ just means the I is incrementing by 1 each time it goes through the loop. So that's like I equals I plus 1. So the first time it goes through, it gets 1. The second time is 2, 3, 4, 5, and it goes all the way until whatever value you set this to. And so because it's 255, and that's exactly what a pulse width modulation pin takes, it jumps out of this once it becomes 256, and it just stays, the pulse width modulation pin just stays at 255 until you tell it to do something else, because everything right here is in serial.available. It's not going to do anything unless you enter in something. And so if we enter in a 0, it will fade out, because the integer I is 255, and you set the condition to go out of the loop when I is greater than or equal to 0, and you're decrementing I by 1 each time it goes through the loop. So it starts off at 255, then 254, then 253, all the way until it gets to 0. The reason why I put a delay here is because if I didn't, it would go too fast for you to see it. So right now I have the serial prompt up, and if I push a 1, you can see the LED fades in. If I push a 0, it fades out. You can make the LED fade in and fade out faster if you change the delay times. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to mesh Arduino with MATLAB. I'm also going to show you how to do the rest of the statements that I was talking about at the beginning of this video. I'll be showing you how to do the while loop in MATLAB. It's essentially the same thing as in Arduino.